Hi, this is Elliot Fishman, and welcome back to our talk on cystic pancreatic masses. This is part 3 of what likely will be 4-part adventure. Now, we left off last time speaking about honeycomb pattern, about 20% of serous cystadenomas. It's multiple tiny cysts that resemble, I guess, a sponge. And you can see it better usually on the venous than arterial phase imaging. You can see the little cystic spaces better on cinematic than routine axial imaging as well. These lesions can have calcification centrally. Here's a 4-centimeter serous cystadenoma. Now, I have to admit, with the microcystic, when you look really quickly, you say, oh, this lesion looks worrisome to me because there's a pancreatic duct dilated. Now, I mentioned to you that these lesions don't arise from the duct, but mass effect can compress the duct. There are some faint calcifications present, but you would look at this lesion carefully because you would worry, could I be missing a carcinoma with a dilated duct and the duct cutoff? You could see it very nicely here as well. This patient would go for EUS, and you get a biopsy, and you make the right diagnosis. So I do want to emphasize that sometimes it's not that easy, because when I see a dilated duct and a duct cutoff, I always worry about malignancy. Maybe it's a cyst with a tumor near it, but I would not be so certain just to call this a serous cystadenoma, but that's what it was. But if you looked at the volume rendering of this case, you saw calcification, and you see the small cystic spaces better. So I have to admit, on the 3D, the idea about a serous cystadenoma is very logical. On the axials or coronals, not so much. Another lesion, body of the pancreas, it's cystic. The distal tail is atrophic. There's a dilated pancreatic duct. Yes, this has septations, but could I be dealing with a tumor? There's no vessel invasion, but there's compression. But again, when you start looking at the coronals, you can really appreciate the cystic spaces. You can see it better on the venous than arterial. And so you got to be thinking about a serous cystadenoma. But I'm positive once you see the dilated duct, you'll be getting proof with EUS to make a definitive diagnosis. Here's the same case with cinematic rendering, septations a little bit better seen. And then, of course, we have the oligocystic pattern. That can be challenging because that can look like a large IPMN. It could look like a mucinous cystic tumor, which has thin septations or no septations. I've also seen a case, and I showed one in conference last week, of a lymphangioma that was near the head of the pancreas that was being followed as a oligocystic serous cystadenoma. It was finally removed because the patient had symptoms and they wanted it taken out, and it ended up not being a pancreatic lesion, but a lymphangioma. So that happens every once in a while. Dilatation can be seen of the pancreatic duct, but that's going to be uncommon. And of course, when you see that duct dilatation, I mentioned you become a little bit more concerned and you don't feel quite as comfortable as just assuming it's a serous lesion. So here's a cystic lesion in the head of the pancreas, well defined. It's a little bit close to the head for an MCN, but it still could be. It could be a large IPMN, so you'd have to do EUS. This was a serous cystadenoma, well defined, water density, no dilated duct, no septations, but you can't just make the call. You could put it in your differential, but you need to work the patient up more. Now, another variety that makes up about 5% of serous cystadenomas that's gotten a lot of popularity lately is the solid variant. Okay, it looks identical to me to one of two possibilities. One is a neuroendocrine tumor, and sometimes when they occur near the head of the pancreas, they can also make you think about a GIST tumor. Okay, and it can be really challenging. Here's one by the tail of the pancreas. Vascular, you would say, this looks like a neuroendocrine tumor. It was a serous cystadenoma. You can see it here on the venous when it washes out. Maybe you could say there's some cystic spaces, and you could think about a serous cystadenoma. But again, neuroendocrine tumors can be somewhat cystic and wash out. Here's another one. large lesion, solid-looking head of the pancreas. But I think this one is not that difficult. You see multiple cystic spaces. Now, neuroendocrine tumors are not always going to be hypervascular, but here I see cystic spaces. My first bet was going to be a serous cystadenoma. And on the coronals particularly, I think it's not a difficult diagnosis. And you can see some stretching of the vessels, that circumvascular sign. So I think you can make the diagnosis. And again, here it is on venous. On the venous, the septations, the cysts, I don't think you're going to start going into a neuroendocrine on this case. But this next one, tail of pancreas, again, solid, very vascular. I don't see the cystic spaces I want to see. This was a solid serous cystadenoma, but if you call this a neuroendocrine tumor, I could not argue with you. There it is. You see some prominent vessels, but neuroendocrine tumors are very vascular. They have prominent vessels. And my favorite guess here probably would have been a neuroendocrine tumor, arterial only. But when it washes out, then you begin to say, boy, that's a lot of washout for a neuroendocrine tumor. They wash out, but here it looks like it's septated. If I only had these lesions, I would look at this and say serous cystadenoma, kind of solid looking, but I see septations. So again, dual phase imaging can be very helpful, and the solids are more difficult to diagnose on the arterial than on the venous phase. And you can see when I went to the cinematic rendering, the cystic components of the lesion are really well seen. This is an excellent example of a serous cystadenoma that's, I think, easy to diagnose on cinematic rendering, but difficult to diagnose on the routine imaging. And just to let you know, within the last month, we published this in the Canadian Radiological Society Journal, Cinematic Rendering and Pancreatic Imaging, Tackling the CD Patterns of Serous Cystadenomas. And we made the point that how cinematic rendering can be very helpful in allowing us to make the correct diagnosis. We mentioned some of the added values of cinematic rendering across the range of appearances of serous cystadenoma. And so I think it'll allow you to make better diagnoses. And here again is just a couple cases from the article comparing the coronal with the cinematic, same plane, how the septations are better seen on the cinematic, or in this case, in the tail of the pancreas, you see some enhancement, you see some calcification, but again, the septations or the honeycomb pattern is better seen on the cinematic rendering than it is seen on the patient's routine axial images. Now, here's a case that's really hard. This was sent in to us for a suspected pancreatic cancer, right? But it looks like there's a mass in the body of the pancreas, kind of looks solid. It has a faint calcification. Usually you don't have calcifications in adenocarcinomas unless the patient has underlying pancreatitis, but it is a concerning lesion. Here it is in the coronal view. On the coronal, it's large, but you see some cystic components, but how do I know that's simply not going to be necrotic change? This is kind of a more difficult case. The borders are not that sharp, particularly medial. What do you do with this case? I think at the end of the day, you're going to get EUS and do a biopsy. The cinematic rendering was easier. You saw the cystic changes. This looks more like a serous cystadenoma. The axial and coronals really didn't help that much, and this ended up being a solid serous cystadenoma. It was eventually resected. The patient had symptoms, but again, giving you the idea of the challenge we face when we evaluate these cases. So some management, if diagnosis of serous can be made on imaging, surgical resection, symptomatic patients, or when lesions get larger, 4 or 5 centimeters, because they're at 4 or 5, easy to resect. If they keep growing, it can be very hard to resect. If they're not classic, like some of those solid lesions. And again, EUS has a VHL marker, which is positive in over 98% of cases. So if you're uncertain and you do EUS, you could make the diagnosis. Okay, let's now go into another category, mucinous tumors. We said 60s and 70s or so were serous. Mucinous is in the 40s or so, usually female. usually body or body toward tail of pancreas. No communication with the pancreatic duct, but it can obstruct the duct. The cysts are usually larger. There's septations. It contains ovarian stroma. Everyone considers these pre-malignant, so if you think about an MCN, it's going to be resected. I did see a recent article that made the point that perhaps MCNs under 2 centimeters you can follow, but that is not the standard of care. Here's a good example. Septated lesion, smooth borders, enhancing wall, faint calcifications, and thickened septations, okay? You could look at this and say, well, what about, a serous? But the septations are thickened, the wall is thickened, location and the age will help you. This article by Galuza, MCNs are typically seen in the 40 to 50 age range, and the serous are the grandma tumors. These are the mother tumors. And again, this ovarian stroma becomes very, very important. Another example, here's a lesion, cystic tail of pancreas. Differential, could be an oligocystic serous, could be an IPMN. In theory, if a patient is 41, can't rule out a SPEN, but an MCN is a good thought. This was resected and had low-grade dysplasia. Again, patient needed distal pancreatectomy. Very well-defined lesion. You did not see the septations we typically see in MCNs, but location is very good and age was very good. Here's another example. Body of the pancreas, perfect location. Look at the septations here and here. That's a classic appearance of MCN. Now, if you have solid nodules in an MCN, you could say high-grade dysplasia or cancer. But when you have thin septations, I don't think you're going to be perfectly right. But again, this was low-grade dysplasia, but it doesn't matter. These are going to be resected. When you get to MCN, they're coming out. And again, when you look at the coronal septations, the thickening is a little bit more concerning. And so this patient had a distal pancreatectomy. Fortunately for the patient, it was a low-grade tumor, and the patient will do fine. You can see in this image, again, the cinematic really shows you the septations and the nodularity better, and the cinematic makes me more concerned than just the axial view as well. Another example, cystic lesion, great location, body of pancreas, multiple septations. It's about 6 centimeters. There's mild dilatation of the pancreatic duct. Again, MCN with low-grade dysplasia. And again, as I mentioned, if I'm reading this and you ask me to grade it, I don't know, there's a lot of septations there, there's a lot of soft tissue. I might worry at least moderate. Maybe I wouldn't say high grade, but that's not the radiologist's job. The radiologist's job is to say, I think this is an MCN. The dysplasia is why the pathologists get paid. Another example, larger lesion, septations. This had high-grade dysplasia. It's large, but you have to admit you don't see lots of nodularity. You see septations, but it's not a whole lot different in terms of septations or more solid component compared to the last 3 or 4 low-grade dysplasias I showed you. So again, CT is not going to give you that answer. And here we go to venous, where the septations are just a little bit better shown. Now in this case, it's easy. This lesion is larger, but look at this nodularity at about 3 o'clock. Septations, larger, solid component, that's high-grade dysplasia. This one is coming out, obviously, but I think from a radiology perspective, I can call it a high-grade dysplasia. And here's a few more images with MIP imaging showing you the solid components. When you have what you think is an MCN and you see solid components, that's going to be high-grade dysplasia or cancer. And here's a few more looks at that lesion. Here's another lesion, large cystic mass. You want to make sure it's not in the liver, but it was from the pancreas, thickened wall, 20 centimeters. Look at its compression of the patient's celiac and SMA, but no invasion. This was toward the head, a little bit toward the body. This was resected. This was a mucinous tumor. Again, thickened wall, you have to worry about high-grade dysplasia. Now, what else can we talk about? Well, what about neuroendocrine tumors? I think what we'll do is let's go back and start with neuroendocrine tumors in the next talk. Neuroendocrine tumors are great mimickers. Classic neuroendocrine tumors are hypervascular, but cystic neuroendocrine tumors are really a challenge. They often have enhancing rim, but they can look like other lesions, and so we're going to talk about them in the next talk, which will be part 4, which will be the last part of this session. And with that, I'll see you in a few minutes. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to the CTisus YouTube channel. You can also visit us at ctisus.com for even more videos, plus quizzes, pearls, protocols, and oh so much more. We're also in the App Store and have well over a dozen apps for iPhone and iPad, all completely free. Thanks for watching.